So we're going to play a little game. You need to guess the city. So there's a picture of a city on the left and there's a picture of a city on the right. So can you guess which cities these two are? Take a look. Can you guess the city? The city on the left is New York in the US, and the city on the right is London in the UK. So in New York, we have lots of these big high-rise buildings, lots of these really big high-rise buildings, and also a lot of skyscrapers. So these big giant buildings here, these are skyscrapers here. There's a river in the background and there's a big park. This is Central Park. There's a big park which is surrounded by buildings. So the park is surrounded by big skyscrapers and big high-rise buildings. In London, we can see a road and there's a taxi here, a man crossing the road and some traffic lights. And there we go. Now, I'm going to talk about the differences between these two cities because I have been to New York once and I've been to London many times. I've been there many times because I live close to London, so I can visit any time that I want. New York, I think, is much bigger. It's much bigger than London. I think the area of New York is much bigger than London. However, I think that the metro system in London is much better than the metro system in New York. In New York, they call it the subway. It's called the subway in America. But in London, they actually call it the tube. So you can get on the tube in London, or we call it London Underground, the Underground as well. The Underground in London, the tube, is far more modern than the subway in New York. Actually, the subway in New York is very old-fashioned. It is incredibly old-fashioned, the subway in New York. So the metro system in London, I think, is much more modern than the metro system in New York. What about these two cities? Can you guess which cities these are? Well, actually, the city on the left, this is Paris in France, and the city on the right, this is Singapore. Now, one of the biggest differences, I think, between these two cities is that Singapore is far more modern than Paris. Singapore is far more modern. Paris has a lot of old buildings, a lot of old architecture, whereas Singapore, all of the buildings are quite new. So the buildings in Singapore are far newer. They are far newer than the buildings in Paris. However, the architecture in Paris is a great deal more impressive than the architecture in Singapore. I would say so. I would say that the architecture in Paris is a great deal more impressive, much more impressive than the architecture in Singapore, in my opinion. Can you guess which cities these two are? Take a look. The city on the left, this is Sydney. In this picture on the left, we can see here the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And there are lots of boats here because this is a harbour. It's a harbour where you keep boats. This is called Sydney Harbour. And that's why the bridge is called Sydney Harbour Bridge. And a harbour is a place where you can put your boat. Many people put their boats in the harbour. The picture of Bangkok is like a bustling city with people walking around everywhere. It's a real bustling city and there's people going everywhere. So what are the differences between Sydney and Bangkok? Well, there are tons of differences. There are tons of differences between Sydney and Bangkok because, to be honest, these two cities are completely different. They are The difference between Sydney and Bangkok, honestly, is night and day. The difference between Sydney and Bangkok is night and day. There is a night and day difference between Sydney and Bangkok, absolutely. An absolute night and day difference. A night and day difference between the two cities. So Sydney is a much more modern city. It's newer. I think it's richer. There's a lot more money in Sydney. However, parts of Bangkok are poor, but there are actually now lots of modern areas of Bangkok because Bangkok has developed a lot. It has developed a lot over the last few years. Over the last decade, Bangkok has developed a lot. So I would say that the shopping malls in Bangkok are probably a lot larger than the shopping malls in Sydney. I think so. I have been to Sydney, I've been to Bangkok, and I would say that the shopping malls in Bangkok are actually far larger than the shopping malls in Sydney, in my opinion. Sydney, of course, is a much more expensive city. It's a much more expensive city than Bangkok. To be honest, living in Sydney can cost a fortune sometimes. Living in Sydney can cost an absolute fortune. Actually, that is even true for New York and London as well. These two cities cost an absolute fortune to live in. They really do. New York is the most expensive. To get an apartment in New York will cost you an absolute fortune, maybe $4,000 a month or something like that. Take a look at these two cities. Can you guess which these two cities are? So the city on the left, this is Kuala Lumpur in the country of Malaysia. And the city on the right, this is Miami in the United States. So on the left, we can see the famous Petronas Twin Towers of Kuala Lumpur. And on the right, we can see the famous beaches of Miami, Miami South Beach or Miami Beach or something. So what are the differences between these two cities? Well, Kuala Lumpur is a great deal cheaper than Miami. Yeah, actually, Miami, honestly, will cost quite a lot. Miami is fairly expensive. So yeah, I would say that Miami is quite a bit more expensive than Kuala Lumpur. I would say so, quite a bit more expensive than Kuala Lumpur, I would say. However, if you ask me, I would say that the food in Kuala Lumpur is far more delicious than the food in Miami. Yes, the food in Kuala Lumpur and the food in Malaysia is far more delicious, far more interesting than the food in the US or Miami. Can you guess what these two countries are? So the city on the left, this is Hanoi in Vietnam. And the city on the right, this is Wellington in New Zealand. So this is the famous train track. See, there's a train track here. This train track goes through the city of Hanoi, and this is a famous tourist spot here. This train track is a famous tourist spot in Hanoi. And you can see the Vietnamese flag here. There are many flags here. So the Vietnamese flag is red with a yellow star in the middle. It's a red flag with a yellow star in the middle. And this is the Vietnamese flag. There are also many cables here. We can see many cables sort of hanging down here. These are electric cables. And yes, in Vietnam, you will often see the electric cables hanging down from the poles. They will hang down like this. This is Wellington in New Zealand, and Wellington is quite a small city, really. But it's a very nice city, very relaxing city. So what are the differences between Hanoi in Vietnam and Wellington in New Zealand? Well, the population of Hanoi in Vietnam is a lot larger. It's a lot larger than the population in Wellington, New Zealand. So there are far more people in Hanoi than there are in Wellington, New Zealand, I would say. Although if you ask me, I would say that Wellington is a far more relaxing city than Hanoi. Wellington is a much more relaxing city than Hanoi, in my opinion, because Hanoi is very noisy, lots of noises, very loud place. Whereas Wellington is a very relaxing, fairly easygoing. It's an easygoing city, Wellington, pretty easygoing. Now then, can you guess which cities are in these two pictures? Take a look. So the city on the left, this is Oxford in the UK, and the city on the right, this is Da Nang in Vietnam. Oxford is actually my hometown. So this is where I am from. I am from Oxford. And Da Nang, I have been to Da Nang as well. So I've been to Da Nang. Actually, I lived in Da Nang for around 6 months. I like both cities. But what are the differences between Oxford in the UK and Da Nang in Vietnam? Well, these are very different cities. Again, the difference between Oxford and Da Nang is night and day, right? The difference is night and day, honestly. They are completely different kinds of cities. And really, there is a night and day difference between these two cities, absolutely. So Oxford is a smaller city. It is far smaller than Da Nang. So there are not as many people in Oxford as there are in Da Nang, right? There are less people in Oxford than Da Nang. Da Nang's population is a great deal larger than the population of Oxford. Yeah, Da Nang's population is far bigger than Oxford. Oxford only has around 150,000 people who live there. On the other hand, Da Nang has more than 1 million people. More than 1 million people live in Da Nang. So the population of Da Nang is far bigger than the population of Oxford. Although, in my opinion, the architecture in Oxford is a lot more interesting than the architecture in Vietnam. The architecture of Oxford is incredibly old, it's traditional, it has been there. The architecture in Oxford has been there for hundreds of years. Lots of the architecture has been there for hundreds of years. On the other hand, the architecture of Vietnam is a lot more modern. So Vietnam, Da Nang is a much more modern city than Oxford. Yes, Da Nang is far more modern than Oxford, I would say. Thank you for watching my video about comparing cities, and I will see you in the next one.